I think of the word interference, and I think oftentimes we're trying to really understand with each athlete uniquely how some of these disturbances from a mental health standpoint are experienced. I come in blank slate because everyone experiences them a little bit different, a little bit similar. And what situations maybe are these some of these challenges maybe more present? And then we're trying to work to understand that, because when you understand anything, you can maybe respond in a timely and tuned way with that after having awareness. So all that to say is I do think individuals and athletes struggle with kind of like a more generalized anxiety presentation. And then for some athletes, it's more domain situation specific. So you think about like competitive anxiety.
It's Kirk Herbstreit.
Oh, Sean McVay.
Kerry Walsh Jennings.
Stuart Legano. Greg Gazan.
John Isner.
Ryan Howard.
Greg McElroy.
Got Drew.
Chris Sale.
Mark DeRosa.
Kate Klubnik.
Derek White.
Reese Davis.
Marty Smith.
Before we jump into today's episode, I want to tell you about Booster. If you got kids playing sports in middle school or high school, Booster is the easiest way to raise money for their team. From uniforms and equipment to travel expenses, Booster makes fundraising simple and fun for schools and sports programs. Check them out at choosebooster.com. That's choosebooster.com, or just click the link in our description to see how your team can boost their fundraising this season.
Welcome back to Pure Athlete. I'm Britt. I'm here in studio with Brad, and Brad, our compadre Jeff, isn't with us today.
I think he's on a flight as we speak.
Yeah.
So hopefully our ratings won't go down because it won't be because of our guests, but maybe because Jeff's not here. But hopefully the B team will do its job.
Yeah, Jeff was supposed to be with us online, but his flight last night got canceled, and he had to rebook this morning. So anyway, a lot going on. You just got back from the beach. You guys have a good time?
We did. Got it was kind of two halves of a vacation, because in the middle came back for the event we did at Mercedes, which was really, really cool.
Yeah.
We had an event for Max Preps and Play On Sports and GoFan. They're all now one company, and we did a live event for about a little bit over an hour, and very, very cool. Very cool being on the field and doing that.
Yeah. Being on the field at Mercedes, I think I told you guys I was down at one end zone at one time before we went on stage, and looking at the length of the field, looking around and just getting a sense of, what it would be like to, run a ball back from the end zone all the way. I probably make it to about the 10-yard line, but it's an awesome thing. And it kind of got the juices flowing for football, which, we're about to get started in.
Yeah, Jeff was griping about the lines. The lines are set up for soccer, not for football. So he was trying to get that changed. But no, it was so much fun. And actually, kind of segueing into this, our guest today is one of the questions we got in the Q&A was, when's the next episode we're going to do regarding mental health and how it affects athletes. And so, if you want to kind of talk about kind of how this led to our guest.
Yeah, exactly. We told that guest that this week we actually were filming with a really special guest, and this is a topic, Brad, you and I've talked about a lot, because both our families have been touched with kids who've struggled with anxiety. Over the years, and we've had to kind of figure that thing out. And for people in our generation, you do kind of have to figure that thing out a little bit, because I think there is a generational, sense about what all that means. And so, we want to always be spending time in this, because it's such an epidemic today for young folks.
Well, and I think as a parent, and I'm sure as the young athlete too, you feel like you're kind of just on an island by yourself when you're dealing with this. And that's why I'm so excited about having experts like we have on today that can give answers, give help, give encouragement, give hope to these families that are dealing with the stuff that we dealt with.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when one of my kids was really struggling and another had struggled, and I was doing my best to provide support, and but I ended up watching with my kid a thing on Netflix, a show on Netflix, all about Marty Fish, the tennis player, and his story. And it changed everything for me to really dig in and understand it really opened my eyes to a lot and really helped me, help my child a lot better.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
so again, we want to be real about these topics. We've got a fantastic guest today. I think we'll go ahead and bring him on. We've got Dr. Riley Nickols, and Riley, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
We're gonna ask you to tell your story here in just a little bit, but just so our audience knows, Riley has a PhD in you can give me the details, but in sports psychology or in psychology, and with a focus in sports. He's been doing this a long, long time. He's an author. He's he coaches. He has a background in sports. He was at the forefront of starting a clinic that he ran for a number of years in St. Louis for disordered eating for athletes. And so he's got a wealth of knowledge to bring to us today. And so Riley, with all that background, tell us a little bit about your story and how you got involved in all this.
Absolutely. Just want to thank you both for making the space and the airtime for mental health and in sport. I think it's highly relevant and worthwhile if you're a parent, coach, or athlete, to say the least. So I think, like most kids, is just absolutely love sports. Growing up playing and watching, of course, and baseball kind of was my passion from a young age, and had aspirations of just playing as long as I could. I just love the game, and had a shoulder injury. I was a left-handed pitcher my senior year of high school, which really was destabilizing on many fronts, and not certainly in life's plans, but that's how life works, and sometimes some beautiful ways as well. And so going through that injury process, just really challenging, to say the least. Like most athletes that have a temporary or permanent injury, had aspirations to play in college, and had a shoulder surgery, I think a week or a week and a half before the start of college, which went to college in a sling, and really tried to rehab and come back, and just realized my external rotation and the flexibility and strength and my velocity just was not where it needed to be to play at that level. So had a very premature exit from sport, and in comparison to my plans, and just that challenge and that abrupt shift in terms of identity and not being able to engage in something that you absolutely love was very challenging to me, and it really charged me with the desire and passion to really support athletes in my career. So I was an accounting major for a semester, and I did a hard left pivot to psychology in the midst of that, and then kind of carried forward and master's in sports psychology, which was great for the mental performance and really supporting athletes in that. And then I realized that more clinical issues are salient and certainly impact kind of the mental performance as well, and they're kind of bidirectional and play off of one another. So I went on to get more grad school training as well after that, and am just really privileged to have the opportunities that I do as a sports psychologist to provide care for athletes. I'm the founder of Mind Body Endurance, and provide care with our staff of mental health providers, sports psychologists, and sport dietitians to athletes across the country. So
awesome. So, just to jump right in, we know, as we just said, that mental health challenges and issues are prevalent among teens and tweens today. What about athletes? We don't, in the news, we've heard more and more in the past, number of years. I mentioned the Marty Fish deal. We've heard about Simone Biles issues, some pro football players. We hear about different things from time to time, but what about young athletes? Is it as prevalent among young athletes as just the normal population?
Yes, I think the short answer is absolutely yes. And then in some cases and situations, athletes have a higher risk kind of in this area to struggle with mental health concerns. There's certainly many protective aspects of sport that we all know to be true. Just in terms of the eyes on you, whether it's coach or athletic trainer or physicians and whatnot too, which is great. But also I think there's an element where there's, like a lot of things, there's a biopsychosocial piece to everything, physical ailments and psychological or mental health. Most all the athletes that I see are extremely driven, motivated, committed individuals. Perfectionism is oftentimes off the charts. which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Also, too, with that wiring, there's this temperament whereby there's just a high degree of self-criticalness, self-punitiveness, and challenge is just being patient and compassionate towards oneself, particularly in the midst of struggle, right? In life, in sport. And so you think about that temperament and wiring, and there's a genetic piece, of course, and then there's an environmental piece. And the combination of all three really are at work with any mental health concern. And you think about with athletes, there's oftentimes at any age, especially youth too, there's just internal pressures that the young athletes feel just because of that, right? And then external pressures, real or perceived, that are very, very present as well. So the combination of all those things are kind of the framework there that sometimes create just a vulnerability to struggle in this space.
So we want to dig deeper into all that, but I want to ask you just a question with some perspective. Do you think this has always been there? Do you think that athletes have always had these issues? It's just now, this may be a positive, that the environment people are more open about sharing their feelings, or athletes about, or do you think this is a recent development that's just gotten worse, that it wasn't there in the past, and it's, whether it's social media or whether it's, NIL, whatever. So was it always there, or is this kind of a new trend in the last, decade?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's hard to answer that definitively. My initial kind of reaction is I absolutely think has always been there, right? It's always been there. I also think some of the dynamics present now in the day and age and this moment in time that we all live in really maybe exacerbate and or intensify kind of some of these struggles. So you think about just like you mentioned, there's much more of a tendency, unfortunately, for early sport specialization with young athletes, which the research is well founded to support kind of the risks inherently from a mental health standpoint, from a burnout standpoint, from a performance standpoint, in conjunction with oftentimes sports are moving much more towards a year-round participation. That's not a good thing, right? Especially for young kiddos. But there's this culture of like, well, you're missing out or you'll be left behind if you're really not actively involved. And families and parents are well-meaning and well-intentioned, of course, and really sometimes buy into this as well. You have, of course, the social media piece, which just amplifies things too in ways that we know in terms of accessibility of information and algorithms that perhaps fuel the beast that is within in a well-intentioned way. So all that to say, I do think some of these mental health struggles for athletes have been long-standing, and I also think that because of those areas I touched upon, in conjunction to a few others, it maybe is amplified as well in this season of life that we're in.
I think that's so interesting because we talk about the risk and dangers of specialization. Or early age specialization in particular. We talk about it so much that people probably get tired of us talking about it. But I think beyond some of the reasons that we talk about it, this whole area of mental health, is yet another reason why putting so much pressure on kids at such early ages, when the finish line isn't, shouldn't be till late high school. And of course, the finish line for so many of them now is, 12 years old, 13 years old, 11 years old, because they're just sick of it and they just can't handle it anymore. So I think that's such a great point. Let me ask you this. Is there a correlation between, athletes by nature are kind of conditioned to push through physical hardship? Mm-hmm. Is there a correlation that because of that, they also try to push through mental hardship as well? And so things get too far before they raise a red flag?
Absolutely. And I think a well-founded strength that a lot of athletes develop is just that, what you spoke to, the ability to push through discomfort, distress at times. I think the kicker, though, is for a moment of time and for a very finite period of time, that's okay. A workout, right? A game, a competition. Yes, there's an element where there's inherent aspects of sport where that's like a demand of the sport. That's essential. I think sometimes athletes maybe overgeneralize or extend that reality to be a broad generalization for how they should engage with training on a daily basis or life. Also, and again, it's well-meaning, it's misguided. So I think any athlete with physical injuries, as the longer some athletes have this wisdom from the get-go, from a young age, young athletes, and for some athletes it takes kind of a lifetime of learning and being wise in these areas, whereby, if you have a little niggle in your hamstring in a practice, a wise athlete would be like, that doesn't feel quite right. Might need to modify their training, go see an athletic trainer to get, some work done, ice, e-stem, whatever it might be, right? For athletes that have that mentality that you mentioned to just kind of push through, well, I think with any physical injury, most likely you push through literally, it is going to speak to you louder and louder and become more interfering and more interfering until you're forced to tap out, right? And I think with mental health, it's no different. Concerns where maybe you're just feeling a little bit less hopeful just about the future, or just less energy, less engaged socially, more on edge, interfering kind of intrusive thoughts, and most all the time those start at kind of like lower levels of interference and intensity, and then if not addressed in a timely, attuned manner by qualified providers, similar to physical injury, they'll just intensify and become more interfering. So I do think it's a strength to push through, but I also think we're trying to work with athletes to help cultivate that wisdom in terms of when it makes sense to, and when it's safe, and when it's appropriate, and then when more support and communicating maybe these disruptions is most needed.
Riley, you talked a little bit about kind of the perfectionism personality of an athlete, and those athletes seem to be harder to, as a parent, harder to I guess the anxiety is harder to see in a type A personality or perfectionist. Like sometimes if a kid kind of withdraws from the sport or doesn't practice as hard, you can maybe recognize the fact that they're dealing with something. But a lot of times if a kid is a type A personality, you don't see that. How as a parent can you identify, I guess in all types of kids, not just type A kids, but whether it's just nervousness, whether it's just normal type feelings that occur when you go through competition or practices versus true anxiety, true debilitating, type mental health issues?
Yeah, I think those qualities of being really dedicated, driven, and motivated are wonderful. We don't want to strip those away. We want to harness them for the good and support and acknowledge. Any parent absolutely would loves that about their children, appreciates. Any coach absolutely loves that in their athletes, right? I also think, though, there's a difference between being dedicated and striving for excellence, and then the perfectionism piece too can rob you of some of these things. So, for example, in the pursuit of excellence, sometimes that perfectionism can rear its head, and there's this relentless pursuit to accomplish whatever it might be, right? But then there's the goalposts just keep moving, and in conjunction with that, not only do the goalposts keep moving once you accomplish something, but there's an inability and or an unwillingness to celebrate those accomplishments, right? So you're working relentlessly, and without kind of the acknowledgement internally, like, wow, way to go, good job, and it just is on to the next thing, right? And so I think oftentimes there's no end point either, and sometimes it's oftentimes fear driven. So meaning, I think any athlete that is wired this way is uncomfortable. It's not desirable to fail, real or perceived. But with that perfectionism wiring, it almost becomes like intolerable. So it's there's fear generating at work here, right? And I also think the wiring with that perfectionism disposition is there's an inability to be curious, because curiosity and judgment cannot coexist. So curiosity for any athlete and any human is a really admirable trait. So I think as a provider, what oftentimes we're trying to do is, yes, cultivate greater compassion towards oneself, and gentleness, while still holding and honoring the really high expectations, right? We're not diminishing that. Trying to build the compassion and patience with yourself, but also trying to foster that curiosity, because curiosity, being curious about yourself, the world, how you engage in your sport, what you maybe might try different, there's an openness, and in that openness of a mindset, there's more receptiveness, and that's where you can learn and grow and improve. But oftentimes that perfectionism, sometimes there's like a rigidity in terms of mindset, inflexibility, which really hampers, that growth and that development that we're working towards. So all that to say is, I think that presentation sometimes creates, you mentioned the anxiety and some of the worry, It's like, how could that not be present if that temperament and kind of that disposition and that internal kind of backlash will be there if kind of those, the results are not, optimal or on par.
Riley, as I think about the parents' role in some of this, I mean, it's easy to identify parents who are just kind of off the deep end in driving their kids. But most parents, are well-meaning, well-intentioned, and they want to help their kids achieve their goals. And clearly many of us at times get a little carried away ourselves, and we have dreams for our kids as well. But what do you see in your practice that you would want to tell parents about how do we contribute to driving these perfectionist kids into dangerous areas?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a wonderful question. Because again, like you said, I operate on the full belief and conviction that parents and coaches are all very well-intentioned and well-meaning. So that's my baseline assumption. I think despite that, when you have a really motivated kid, right, who just wants to go, there's a tendency to just let them go, right? And I think there's a time and a place and an age in life developmentally where that makes sense. But what I oftentimes see is that because of that wiring, there often is a need. You asked what parents can do. There is a need to pull back. And it seems counterintuitive, right? If there's another opportunity, there's fall ball or a summer league or something else, right? That there's an opportunity. But oftentimes less is more. And there's really just well-founded research over the decades, brain and body, what genuine rest on a micro basis, so on a weekly basis for us all, and especially from sport, rest and disengagement, but then on a more macro basis, a season, a year cycle, right, is so vital. And oftentimes I think there is an absence of that. A lot of the kids I work with, the biggest challenge is scheduling, because they have maybe 1 or 2 free hours a week. It's just how it is, and it's normalized. And I think that's the thing that's so sad from the outside and seeing that. And again, it's all good stuff, these extracurricular activities or sports stuff, and it's great. But I think as parents, when there is a lack of downtime and just allowing kids just to be or be bored, heaven forbid, right? Be bored. I think there's such richness in that, and we need that as human beings. And I think sometimes kids too just have an absence of that schedule, unfortunately, and they're overscheduled. And again, there is this notion, and I had 2 athletes in my office, adolescents, I think age 13 and 12 last week, saying well, I have to keep doing these things, because if not, colleges are not going to be interested in me. And so there's this, from a very young age, this sense that if I don't continue in my sport or in multiple sports or these clubs at school, then that's somehow going to disqualify me or make me less, desirable as an applicant, and this is sometimes 6 years down the road we're talking. So I think all that for parents, having that zooming out and even asking another provider too, because I think sometimes parents talk to other parents. And if this is just normalized, this way of being in life, overscheduled, you kind of become desensitized to it in a way, right? And so I think getting alternative perspectives and giving some honest feedback, I think from providers or others, I think is really needed just to have another lens at which you're viewing things.
There is one person and one person only who will define your kid's dreams, and that's your kid.
If you want something, you have to work for it.
Your ability to counter a weapon is paramount to your game development.
Or just losing perspective on what youth sports are really about.
Teach your kid the value of winning, but not at all costs.
Get a lot of questions on when an athlete should start strength training.
If your athlete follows my protocol, they are going to have better energy than ever before.
They can't come to you when you're born and say, you got character. You got to build that.
You can win, but if you're not really impacting lives, I think you lose.
Riley, when you talk to your patients or treat your patients, are you noticing, like you talked about nature versus nurture or environmental versus kind of how they were born? And I guess that's my question is there a breakdown to, because my son dealt with anxiety that was triggered by an event that when he was playing a sport. How many kids do you see that had that anxiety that's the result of just how they were just born with it, or the anxiety is environmental or was triggered by something that happened that created that anxiety?
That's yeah, uh, wonderful question. I would say, I don't want to say exactly a 50-50 split, but I would say close to it, right? For some people, like with what you're saying, I have a baseball player I'm working with, and he really had a verbally and emotionally abusive coach, really shamed him, and in profound ways that still affect him now, 7 years later outside the sport, right? And during that instance, when he was kind of ridiculed, he developed the yips. So the yips in baseball, he's a catcher, right? And so that was a very specific, like targeted incident, like you said, that really kind of was a catalyst for maybe this vulnerability to struggle in this way, where the anxiety was really present in the context of baseball, but also generally too. And then conversely, there are individuals, and we all like are wired similarly and differently, that sometimes just have maybe above kind of a baseline anxiety where it's more generalized, right? In certain situations, it kicks up more so, but in general, kind of your baseline just hits a little bit higher. And so that's a very common too with athletes that I see. So it's trying to kind of work within that framework and more. I think of the word interference, and I think oftentimes we're trying to really understand with each athlete uniquely how some of these disturbances from a mental health standpoint are experienced. I come in blank slate because everyone experiences them a little bit different, a little bit similar, and what situations maybe are these some of these challenges maybe more present. And then we're trying to work to understand that, because when you understand anything, you can maybe respond in a timely, attuned way with that after having awareness. So all that to say is I do think individuals and athletes struggle with kind of like a more generalized anxiety presentation. And then for some athletes, it's more domain situation specific. So you think about like competitive anxiety, pretty normal. But sometimes it's in the context of their sport or a higher pressure situation where that anxiety is really exacerbated, and body thoughts and everything kind of take over and are really interfering. And that is the most maddening thing for athletes, where they put in the time, the effort, they have the talent. And then in those situations, because of circumstances, they're not able to deliver and perform in ways they're totally capable of. So nothing occurs in a vacuum. And I think it kind of can transcend in both of those instances, whether it's more nature, more nurture kind of presentation for some of these mental health concerns.
Riley, when it comes to like the event you talked about with the catcher, how hard is it to find that trigger event? I mean, what are some of the exercises that you do or the procedures you do that maybe if you kind of realize that, okay, they are this way, they've got the yips, or are they dealing with this because of there's something that triggered it? How hard is it to kind of find that or discover that event that did that?
Yes, sometimes you got to do some digging, right? I don't think you want to understand without trying to like go fishing and trying just to be like, that's why, because usually we don't operate in a lab as human beings, and so there's multifaceted variables that oftentimes are contributed to everything. I think just broadly, human beings in the context of suffering, we naturally try to look to find meaning in that, right? Because suffering without meaning is senseless. And so for your example, like, well, oftentimes it's like, why am I so activated? And sometimes there's a distinct like reason, right? There's trauma and anxiety that can result from an injury, right? For some obvious reasons, or witnessing something or experiencing something that was done to you. And so sometimes it's a pretty clear incident in life or experience that maybe was a catalyst to some of these challenges. And then other times it's like, I don't really know. And I think for some athletes too, that actually is quite invalidating when they say, wow, my depression is very crippling at times. I don't have a reason to be sad. I have a great life. I have parents that love me. I have everything that I could want. And I just feel really down. So there's almost like criticism. I would call that the secondary emotional response. So the primary emotional response is maybe sadness, lacking hopefulness. But then the secondary emotional response is being critical and judgmental because you feel that way. And so I think when you're trying to find meaning and understanding, I think it's a beautiful thing. We embark on that together in our work with my work with athletes. And sometimes there is a greater understanding in context. And then other times it just seemingly came out of nowhere or just started freshman year of high school also, right? For certainly reasons, but maybe reasons from the athlete's end that like, for no reason. So I think it's a little bit of both and holding both possibilities. Yes.
So that's really interesting. I want to ask you, from a layperson or from a parent's perspective, and this may not be a right way to think about it, but I kind of think about a continuum of anxiety, if you will. And on one end of the continuum, it's like just nervousness as you're stepping up to the plate, or right before the gun goes off to start the swim or whatever. On the other end of the continuum is like crippling anxiety where you can't function. So, for parents out there, Riley, I think people struggle with like, when is it normal? And I, as a parent, ought to be able to help my child through this versus what are the signs that say, we're moving into dangerous territory and we may need to get some more professional help.
Yeah, that distinction is really, really important. Like you said, I think there's some normative anxiety in the context of life, giving a presentation or sport. And then there's an intensity and interference of a mood disturbance of anxiety that is crippling, to say the least. And so I think oftentimes like that, as a parent, most parents are saying wonderful things and are really gentle and really supportive, but also feel really ineffective to provide some relief for their child. And then also, so I think about it in terms of, to what extent does your child have awareness of like at lower levels? Because even though, it might feel like this is crushing anxiety, kind of a borderline, like almost like panic attack, right? Where you just have to tap out and it really is destabilizing. It feels like it goes from like 0 to 100 instantly. It feels like that. Oftentimes it doesn't. It's starting at lower intensities, maybe a couple days before, maybe a day before, maybe morning of competition, whatever the situation might be. And it intensifies. And so the goal being is like trying to build that awareness earlier so that you can respond and work on trying to develop skills to self-soothe that distress, to regulate emotions at lower intensities, because it's much easier, more likely to have a greater ability to do so at lower intensities. When anxiety is almost like you said, that other end of the continuum, kind of that crushing, almost panic attack, it really, you can do everything in your power and really feel really ineffective just because the intensity of things are what they are. So I think to your point, I think when your child, I think recognizes that my body is sending me cues, but I feel ill-equipped to respond, or my responses aren't providing me with relief and they're actually getting worse, then I think that it's really hard to enjoy your sport or enjoy life, enjoy being in social situations when that is the experience. And that is where I think bringing in some support to really address and understand, these challenges is just so vital. Because there's a normativeness, like you said, in the context of sport, but then there's just a mood presentation or a mood disturbance that really is pretty debilitating and takes away not only enjoyment, but performance, and can affect and transcend sleep, right? Can be difficulty getting quality sleep, falling asleep, staying asleep, can affect relationships, can affect appetite. So it really kind of, the effects are widespread thereafter, if not addressed.
Well, this is great. Yeah, Britt and I talked before we started. This is so close to home with us. So we both dealt with it especially with our sons and during their athletic pursuits. And so this is just such great information. We appreciate you doing this. You've done a lot of work with eating disorders, specifically with athletes. Can you talk a little bit about just how they are affected versus a non-athlete, because it's been such a problem in our society in general. But can you kind of distinguish like what makes it particularly hard for athletes, or not hard, but different?
Yeah, I think that there are aspects of an eating disorder that can make it really challenging to identify in the context of sport. So for example, a very common symptom of an eating disorder is unbalanced excessive training. Well, for athletes, oftentimes excessive or additional training can be reinforced positively by coaches and other athletes, right? Being mindful of like nutrition, sometimes culturally within sport, it's like, well, you're working so hard, you've got to fuel yourself in a really thoughtful, deliberate way. Again, can be normalized in the context of some teams, sport culture, families even, but can really be a byproduct of an eating disorder where that rigidity, lack of freedom, lack of flexibility with what you're eating, types of foods, quantity of food, is there. So I think from an early identification in the context of sport with an athlete struggling in these ways, it actually complicates identification, which is really vulnerable, obviously, for athletes to get timely care. For female athletes, there's a lot of myths out there in sport culture, as we all well know. And there still is this myth that if I'm training hard, not getting my menstrual cycle is normal and okay. No, it's not. It's a vital system of the body that if there is lacking nourishment or a low energy available state in the body's wonderfully resilient and slows down systems of the body, right? To preserve energy. So for example, your hormonal functioning is not a vital system of the body for you to stay alive, but it does require energy. So for females, you might see an absence of menstrual cycle. For males, it might be low testosterone because that requires energy. You think about from an athlete's heart, how many times have we heard, you have a low heart rate because you're an athlete? As a provider, we want to bang our heads against the wall when we hear this for an athlete with disordered eating, right? And or an eating disorder, because again, the heart is a muscle, requires energy to beat normally. When there's a lack thereof, it slows down to conserve energy. So there's a big difference between an athlete's heart and kind of a sick / malnourished heart as well. So I think there are some things that are normalized within the context of sport, or you just have providers or parents that maybe just chalk it up to, it's just the fact that really motivated and invested in their sport. And that's why they have these relationships with food, body, and training. So the identification piece, I think, for athletes is really, really challenging to identify if and when these struggles occur in a timely way.
So you mentioned something in that. You used the word myths, and people of my generation, a lot of people, when they think of eating disorders, they just think of the young girl who looks in the mirror and says, I don't like the way I look. I'm too fat. And they obsess with that. And that eating disorders are, primarily a female thing, not a male thing. Can you kind of dispel some of those myths and talk? And you also said disordered eating and eating disorders. Is there a distinction in those two things? Can you just talk about all of that and kind of educate us a little bit, especially as related to athletes?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we've come a long way just to like acknowledge the work that's being done in the context of society and sport, especially with just broadly mental health. And then specifically with eating disorders, we still have an awful long way to go because I still think there's just some really misconceptions out there about like what an eating disorder is, what is fueling it, how it started, and what sustains it that is really off base. That I think as an athlete struggling in this way, it is really insulting and dismissive to chalk it up to like whether it's society or media to be like, well, you just don't like the way you look, and that's why you're struggling. And that is just, I think, grossly insulting and just off base. So similar to like there's a biopsychosocial piece to like the genesis and development and sustainment of eating disorder. Athletes that I work with are very high functioning, very insightful. And I think to also chalk up an eating disorder as well, they just are engaging in these restrictive tendencies or practices so they can become a better athlete, right? And a lot of athletes I work with fully are aware that their performance is tanking or their injuries are at a much higher rate than they ever were previously as a result of their disordered eating disorder. But this is where the mental health condition of an eating disorder, this is a psychiatric illness. And this is not at all meant to pathologize anybody. But I think with any mental health condition, we were just talking about anxiety, right? And I think with anxiety, you're maybe somatically, your heart rate's elevated, your skin temperature is elevated, your muscle tension is increased, maybe there's racing thoughts. And it feels like you're in danger, right? And that's, I think, the challenge of this is like in those situations and maybe you experience anxiety, you're like, no, I know I'm safe. I'm safe. My life or health is not at risk right now, but my body and brain are sending me other signals, right? And I think similarly with an eating disorder, there is an awareness of like, wow, I'm really disengaged interpersonally in my relationships and my mood has changed. My health is deteriorating objectively from what I'm being told by my care team, my doctor, and my providers. My injuries are maybe more present. My sport performance maybe is more inconsistent. I'm not recovering as much workout to workout. And despite all of that knowledge, it's necessary, but it's also not sufficient oftentimes for change to happen, right? And just a light switch to be like, okay, I'll just choose differently. So that's where I think just, again, not to pathologize individuals struggling in this context, but because of that, it really takes like a multidisciplinary team. So a licensed mental health provider that understands sport and has eating disorder eating expertise, a sport dietitian with eating disorder eating expertise, and a physician also that has sensitivity in these areas too, to comprehensively support an athlete. So I think with your question, and you're right, it is also on a continuum. There's disordered eating, which I think we all engage in it to some capacity because we're human, right? Sometimes we eat more than, like is comfortable for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we miss a snack or meal and we don't eat enough. And sometimes there's dysregulated eating patterns due to stress, lack of sleep. And so that's kind of disordered eating, right? And as that disordered eating kind of is present and morphs, there is maybe more dysregulated eating patterns, periods of restriction, periods of binge eating. Sometimes there's feelings of guilt and shame associated when you deviate from what is familiar and comfortable, or maybe rules that you have with yourself in terms of working out, what your body looks, feels like, body composition, weight, exercise. So there's guilt and shame when you deviate from these like self-imposed rules, or rules that are like pulled together and cobbled together via a salad bar approach from like social media, peers. This is what coach said. And you kind of construct and cobble together a really well-intentioned framework, but is really misguided and not supported by science. So the longer disordered eating is a hugely vulnerable state for athletes. And no one wakes up one morning with like an eating disorder and then the previous day they didn't have one, right? So usually there is disordered eating for a period of time. Coupled with that, usually there's unbalanced training that is not nutritionally supported and not periodized. Periodized training is rooted in science, right, over the last like 6 decades. But athletes that struggle in this capacity are apt to add on additional workouts that coaches give them. That's well-intentioned, but it blows up that periodization. Your training is no longer periodized when you're adding workouts, right? I don't know about you. I've never met a coach that has undertrained their athletes, right? So all that to be said, on that continuum, the longer that this disordered eating persists, it affects energy levels in the body. So there's a low energy availability, meaning we have energy needs as humans. If and when those energy needs are not met on the daily basis, there's a deficit, there's a gap. So it's a low energy available state, right? And over a couple of days, that's not super problematic or interfering, but over a couple of weeks, a month, that deficit gets larger and larger. And there's a term called the relative energy deficiency in sport. And that is exactly that. And there's a lot of free resources. I'm on the U.S. Olympic Committee's expert REDS panel, and we consult on these cases with athletes with this presentation. And it's helpful. There's a wonderful visual in terms of systems of the body that can and will be impacted, and then also too other things too. And the longer that persists, it is a huge vulnerability and a catalyst to meet diagnostic criteria at some point for an eating disorder. So that's a long-winded explanation, I guess, but hopefully that kind of provides an illustration about maybe how some of these things progress to that point.
So what's ironic, I guess, sadly, is that most athletes are so in tune with their bodies. They know when something's off. They know when they're not performing at the level they need to perform at. And they may even recognize, and maybe they won't, that it's because they're not eating healthy or they're not getting enough the nutrients or whatever it is. But you're saying it's because it's a mental condition. It's a struggle because they know that. So are they aware of what's causing their lack of performance, or is there a block there somewhere in their mental functioning that they're not really correlating the fact that they're eating poorly or they're eating wrong to lack of performance?
Yeah, sometimes there's lacking awareness, and part of, as a sports psychologist, try to cultivate and build that awareness, obviously, collaboratively. But sometimes there's a really distinct awareness, right? Yeah, I'm just like not recovering from workout to workout, or I'm not progressing, or I'm really inconsistent with my energy levels at practice. But that's where the kicker is. Despite that awareness, it doesn't really maybe bother them in ways that it would have in the past prior to these struggles. In the past, it's like any athlete that's really dedicated. If something is impairing your performance, they're like, no, like I don't have room for this, right? I'm addressing this. I'm like exhausted. I have to prioritize sleep this weekend to get caught up here because I didn't get enough. And they're like really dedicated to that, right? In this space, because it is a mental health condition, there is that awareness, but there's not urgency. There's lacking awareness too about maybe how the totality of how compromised they are. And I even think of compromised of just when your brain is malnourished, it cycles between thinking about food, body, exercise, way more than you would in a nourished brain, right? So there's a lack of freedom even of just like what you think about and where your attention is. So there's a lack of awareness in some regards, but a corresponding lack of urgency to take corrective, immediate action to prioritize health and make changes too. So those two things, lack of awareness, lack of urgency, are oftentimes at play with athletes struggling in this space.
Riley, I had a coach come up to me actually this past week, a soccer coach, and he was struggling with how to approach his goalkeeper because his goalkeeper, he felt like was not fit enough for that position. Was lacking athleticism because they weren't in shape. But he was also trying to be sensitive to the fact that he's trying to be sensitive to the fact if someone is overweight or someone is not in shape on how does a parent or a coach, because there's a standard of fitness that's required for an athlete in their sport, but how does a parent or coach approach that delicately, that situation where, hey, there's a standard, but at the same time they don't want to cross that line.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's also being aware of when they can kind of say something and when they can't say something.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful question. I'm really glad you brought that up. I think in those instances, yeah, some coaches and parents that have attunement and sensitivity kind of like feel like kind of handcuffed, right? Like, I don't know what to say here. But that shows they're thinking about it, right? And the last thing they want to do is oversimplify and just say, because what we hear sometimes for lacking sensitivity when parents and or coaches do is it's oversimplified to be like, hey, you need to lose 10 pounds. Come on, like let's get after it. That'll make you a better player. And that is really sideways too and can be destructive. The weight piece is, there's a slide that I present on that there's like 40 factors that have been well founded to impact sport performance. Weight and body composition are two of those factors, but there's also like 38 other factors, right? So sometimes coaches and or parents zero in on maybe weight and or body composition disproportionately. And so I think in that instance, what I would suggest is to really focus on, hey, I just know like your reaction time is really not where it was last season. I wonder if we can kind of really talk to a strength and conditioning coach or trainer to really work on like agility, reaction time, or your endurance is really strong the first half of practice, but really kind of drops off the second half of practice. I wonder if we can kind of think about ways to cultivate that. So you're addressing it, but it's not zeroed in to anything about their body. Any weight, any body composition, it's not that, right? It's other behavioral things that we can do to maybe shore up some of these deficiencies that really are needed for his position, or her position in the context of soccer, while also reminding ourselves as coaches and parents that language matters and is so important. So how we talk about food and or bodies or comparisons or judgments that we make are so impactful, and our athletes and kids hear about this. So what messaging are we sending our child, our athlete to with our language and how we talk about things too? It's so important just to be mindful and have awareness about how some of these things are addressed. Do we prioritize, wow, we've been at practice for 3 hours. Like, are there adequate hydration breaks? Is our snacks available? Like, and if not, what message does that send, right? to everyone. It's not important. It's an afterthought, right? Or coaches are talking about their own bodies in a really destructive manner, or evaluative, and of course, or parents, right? And so I think we all have a role in this, but I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
Great.
So Riley, again, getting very practical with parents, who, I think if their kids, if they start suspecting their kids are struggling with eating, I mean, beyond normal struggling with eating, and parents typically, can get frustrated with just, you need to eat more. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. I mean, what do parents look out for that triggers within a parent that, we're in dangerous territory? Same question we asked about anxiety. We're in dangerous territory. We need to get some help before we get even further
Absolutely.
Down the road.
Yeah, great question. So I think practically, and this is certainly not going to be an exhaustive list, but what comes top of mind here might just be, your child and just changes in terms of mood. There's never such a thing as an eating disorder without co-occurring mood disturbance, right? There's never such thing as like, oh, this is just an eating disorder. If you think about malnourishment, it impacts just your ability to regulate and self-soothe. So we see depression symptoms and or anxiety intensify in the context of low energy availability, malnourishment, right? So changes in mood, changes in desire to connect with others. Usually there's like a distancing, so they're not as connected to the family unit, not showing an interest proactively in spending time, initiating spending time with friends and peers. Sometimes there's a greater preoccupation to food, talking about food, body. Sometimes they're just as visibly uncomfortable in maybe spontaneous eating situations. Hey, let's go to this restaurant, right? And there's a discomfort, or there's feelings of guilt or shame after deviating from some of these rules. There's an inflexibility from like missing workouts. It's okay to have a preference because you're a dedicated athlete, but oftentimes athletes struggling in this way experience like utter distress if and when a workout is missed or doesn't go according to plan due to weather, due to sickness. So I think all of those things can be indicative that there is greater internal struggle. Athletes present oftentimes and they are very high functioning. So it's a strange thing as a parent to be like, my kid's still getting like straight A's in school. They're performing at a high level. And I think what's something that I think we all can attest to is that the human brain and body are so incredibly resilient for a period of time. And despite being unwell, can perform seemingly at a very high output. So I think as parents, as coaches, when you know your child or athlete really well in the ways that you do, when you notice deviations from what you know of your child, I think the best thing is from a place of love and concern, not at all to name, hey, I think you have an eating disorder. That's not, that'll put them on the defense, right? But more just, I'm concerned about you. You just don't seem quite like yourself recently, right? And just talking maybe more non-judgmentally about maybe behaviors, shifts or changes or things you're observing is a great place, while also knowing there's absolute support that is readily available also in the midst of this, just to try to work through some of these things to foster healing and freedom.
Man, we talked before we came on today about just our kids and all the injuries that our kids had to deal with, and just, and you're so focused on, well, first of all, it's brutal because sports is about competition and you're always worried about losing your spot. And I think as parents, you worry about it, as kids, you worry about it. But we talk about the rehab, the physical rehab, but can you give any practical advice? Because it's so mentally hard and mentally draining for an athlete that's dealing with just not even just one injury, but multiple injuries. Just, how do you as a parent, I guess, help your kid during that time where they're trying to battle back again and again from injuries? And also the athlete, I guess, as well.
And before you answer that, I just want to add a personal note. And I think I told you a little bit about this before we went on camera, but my son had like 4 major injuries. And when he got, the first 2 didn't seem like they had a mental impact on him. By the last one, and it was in the middle of recruiting season and all that, I mean, he got to a point of distress mentally over, I'm not going to achieve this thing that I've worked so hard for, and it's completely out of my control. And it was distressing to me. It was distressing to him. I mean, it was distressing to me because he was distressed about it. But can you just, Brad's question, just go for it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful one. And I think something that as parents, it's hard to see your child suffer or be in distress or hurt, physically or emotionally. It's just hard. And I think naturally as a parent, you want to kind of provide some relief, sometimes fix things, right? And we recognize our limited powers and that sometimes is a frightening thing as a parent to be reminded of that. It's humbling. I think the first, response I would say is, I think there's a very normative response just psychologically and emotionally to an injury. If that's a short term, that'll take you out of sport. If that's a long-term injury or a long-term surgery and recovery, period. And I think just normalizing and allowing space for there to be the natural responses as a human being, not a robot, right, to respond to that reality. Sometimes what I see is well-meaning providers too. It's like, let's get in there and fix it. And this is your rehab protocol. And there's an element of that that's needed pragmatically. I also think to allow space to grieve, grieve of wow, this was totally abrupt and unexpected, like most injuries are, right? This was not in the cards in the plans here for this season or life. And holding space for that, because the stages of grief of losing a human being, Kubler-Ross's death and dying, it's really relevant, has been shown to kind of also be applicable to injury process. So you have sadness or depression, you have denial, you have bargaining, you have anger sometimes, and you have acceptance eventually, right? And it's not this linear process where you just move through the stages seamlessly. Sometimes you'll cycle back and stay in a stage. And so I think just holding and normalizing that reaction, I think is appropriate. I also think there's a normative response to injury, right? And then there's one that's a bit more pathological and more interfering, and I think is really impacting just their functioning as a human being, their relationships. And I think that distinction is a really important one, too. So it's, of course, you're going to have a reaction, but if this carries over and persists or intensifies to a place that really is debilitating to your child or your athlete's functioning, then I think absolutely vital for more support is needed to really provide support in a similar and different way that maybe parents and coaches can too. Some organizations, and again, we're all lacking resources and staff, of course, but I know I consult with some college athletic departments, and for some athletic departments, it is protocol. When an athlete gets injured, they meet with a mental health provider very shortly thereafter. It's part of the protocol, just like you would with an athletic trainer, a physician. I know that's not practical always, but I do think that safeguards and keeps a pulse on things. Yeah.
That's really smart.
Yeah, I wish I'd known that. I would have done it in a heartbeat looking back. So Riley, last question for you to our audience. If you could give parents any advice at all in this area, just to leave them with, what would you say?
Oh, that's a wonderful one. I'll try to be concise here. I think the things that you're bringing up and questions you're asking are wonderful. And I think just to reiterate and reinforce keeping those top of mind, and to know that you really mean well and have the best intentions for your child as a parent. And also there oftentimes is less is more, meaning less practice time, less teams, less commitments, less involvement. And again, I'm sensitive to that. It's not a light switch you just flip, but I do think it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost. And there's a time and a place where that specialization is maybe just needed. That is not early adolescence. It is not. And I just think really checking the research out there, checking your own preferences and or biases and wants for your child is really important. To have that honesty, to getting a different perspective is really, hey, I just want to bounce some stuff off. This is what we're thinking, or this is kind of what, my kiddo's life looks like or has looked like the past year. Is this balanced? Are we missing something? And I just thinking being open to reevaluating as a family unit. Sports are really time and resource intensive, as we know, and there's beauty in that. But it can also hijack a family system too. It can. And at the unintentional expense of your child's emotional well-being and physical development too. So I think just having awareness of that, I think, is so needed. And the last thing I'll say is just, I think, recognizing your child's strengths, right? And I just think that parents are well-meaning, and especially if a parent has a prior involvement in sport that their child is playing, which is great. You can connect and relate. I also think sometimes there's a tendency to really zero in on maybe areas that they can improve, right? Especially after a game or competition. And I think that car ride home, is so vital. And we hear that talked about a lot. As a parent, we don't need to rub our kids' faces into it and to bring to awareness of what they didn't do well, what they could have improved. They know that. They're first ones. So I think just to kind of recalibrate and reassess, what am I saying to my child, like on the heels of competition or thereafter? And I think something as simple as like, I really loved watching you out there. Thank you for allowing me that opportunity. Beautiful, right? Beautiful. There might be a time and a place with some space, with some days go by to maybe reflect on what, to process and debrief. That time is never right after competition. And so I know that might seem obvious, but I think I can't reiterate that. The delicacy and the vulnerability of that time immediately after a competition or a game, in that interaction with parents too.
Well, it might seem obvious, but we all need reminders all the time because it's really, really challenging for parents. And so, man, this was fantastic content, fantastic advice and expertise you've shared with us and shared with our audience. I wish I had had it when my kids were 10, 11 years old, but I'm glad we get to share it now. So, Riley, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great information, Riley. Thank you very much. We'd love to have you on again.
Absolutely. It was a privilege. And thanks so much for creating the airtime for these important issues. So thanks for having me.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out more videos from us right here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a thing. Follow us on social media at Pure Athlete Inc. for even more content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.